All right, here we're looking at section 7.7 notes. And again, we've got one learning target today, is I can factor perfect square trinomials and the difference of squares. These are just two different patterns of factoring. So we've looked in 3 sections about how to factor different polynomials. Okay, this is just some special ones that we need to be able to factor as well. So on your learning targets, just make a note of where you can find that in your notes so you can flip back and forth. So let's find where we were. Here's what we did last section, looking at factoring. We have 2 different things today, 2 different patterns that we want to recognize. I want to tell you that if you don't recognize these patterns when you're actually working through it, if you can still factor what we did in 7.6, that ax squared plus bx plus c, you'll be able to do this. You'll get the same answer no matter what. Okay, so let's look at our perfect square trinomials. Okay, so a perfect square trinomial is something that looks sort of like this. It must be a degree 2. So it's a quadratic, right, because I have a squared term. It must have 3 terms, which are, way to say that is a trinomial. It has 3 terms. And then I have to know a and b must be perfect squares. Okay, so a perfect square is something like 4, 9, 16, 25. It's something I know the square root of. So 81 would be a perfect square because the square root of 81 is 9. Okay, so I have 2 different possibilities here. I can have a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, or I have a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. Okay, so my results from this top one, if they're both positive, I'm going to add the square roots of the 2 of them. Okay, and square that. If I have this negative minus 2ab, here's what my final answer will be. And we're going to walk through kind of an example of why that really works. Okay, so here's my steps for doing this. So if I recognize, oh, I know the square root of this one, and I know the square root of this one, but then if I multiply them together times 2, that's what I get in the middle. That's what we're really looking for. Okay, so I first take the square root of a, then I take the square root of b, and then I decide on my sign. So for this example, I have 25x squared plus 100x plus 100. Well, I know the square root of this one, and I know the square root of this one. So let's go ahead and try this. So I end up with the square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 100 is 10. So I can rewrite this. So I end up with 5x at the beginning for both of them, because don't forget that x squared term becomes x. Since they're both being added up here, my signs are positive, 10. Okay, so it becomes 5x squared plus 10. So here's our next example. So here I have 16x squared minus 72x plus 81. So again, I know the square root of this first one, and I know the square root of my second one. So let's go ahead and find that. So the square root of 16 is 4, and the square root of x squared is x. I'm going to put that in here as well, because that's also part of my first term. Square root of 81 is 9. Well, let's just see if I get this 72 in the middle. Well, 9 times 4 is 36, times 2 gives me 72. So I know that this follows one of my patterns in one of my rules. So I can go ahead and continue. So since this is subtraction, I know that I'm going to have subtraction here in between my 2 terms in here. So I end up with 4x as the first part, minus 9 as the second part. Since these 2 things are the same, I can rewrite it as 4x minus 9 squared. Okay, so that's our perfect square trinomial. That's just the pattern that we're really going to be looking for. So make sure you keep this out for when you're working on it. So the second pattern we're looking really at is factoring the difference of squares. Now this one you're going to use a bunch, so make sure you recognize this. One thing I want you to think about is, what does difference mean? Difference means I'm subtracting. So I'm subtracting 2 squares. Okay, that's the pattern I'm looking for. So again, I must have a quadratic, so my degree is 2. I only can have 2 terms. I only have my x squared term and my constant. That's the 2 terms, so it's a binomial. I also have to be able to know the square root of this first chunk, my first term, and my last term. Okay, so again, I take the square root of a, and I take the square root of, this should be, say, c. I take the square root of c, and one's positive and one's negative. Okay, so my example is to factor 81x squared minus 36. So first thing I notice is I'm subtracting, so that's my difference. I have 2 terms, and I know the square root of this first one, and I know the square root of my second one. So the square root of 81 is 9. The square root of x squared is x. That's important because this is in that first term as well. and the square root of 36 is 6. So then I have my 9x at the beginning, and my 6 is my second piece. But since this is the difference of two squares, one is positive and one is negative. Okay, so that's really kind of more a simple one that we're going to see, but you will see this one a lot. So when we're down here, I want you to note that this does not just go when I'm factoring. So I don't just go from here down to here. If I see something like this where they look the same, only one's a plus and one's a minus, this is what I'm going to be looking at. This is how I can get back up here. So I know that I can actually multiply them out, or I can follow this pattern and get back up here anyways. So now that's it for our learning target for 7.7, being able to factor the difference of squares and some perfect square trinomials. So now that you have these, go ahead and work on that homework and let me know whenever you get stuck or have questions.